I'm with Michael Mistretta from Fellowship of Israel-Related Ministries, and we're talking about the Jewish holiday of Purim. Now, Michael, what is Purim?
Well, it's great to be with you again, Paul. Purim is a very fun holiday that we have in Israel, and it's all celebrated by Jews around the world. Purim actually means, the word pur is, in Hebrew is lots, but it's celebrating the story of Esther and the defeat of Haman when the Jewish people, the Israelites, were in the land of Babylon, and they were serving another king. There was this man named Haman who cast lots, and he hated the Jewish people. He hated Mordecai the Jew, and he wanted to destroy and annihilate the Jewish people. And obviously we know that hasn't happened, as evidenced by the state of Israel today, and that Jews are still around today because of the faith and the belief and the strength of this woman in the Bible we read about named Esther, the Jewish princess who marries into this royal family, becomes a queen, Queen Esther, and she saves her people. And so we celebrate it in Israel and all around the world as the day when the Jews were saved from their enemies and overcame and existed as a people.
Is this a biblical holiday in Israel?
Well, that's a funny question because it's not biblically mandated by God. There are the Lord's feasts that you can read about in Leviticus 23 that talk about like the Feast of Passover and the Feast of Sukkot, the Feast of Booths, or the Feast of Shavuot, the Feast of Weeks. So it's not mandated by God, but it is biblical in the sense that it is in the Bible, in the book of Esther. And it actually says here in Esther chapter 9 that Mordecai was the one that mandated Purim. It says Mordecai recorded all these events, and he sent letters to all the Jews through all the provinces of King Xerxes, near and far. And he said that they have to celebrate annually the 14th and 50th days of the Hebrew month of Adar, as the time when the Jews got relief from their enemies, and the month when their sorrow was turned into joy, and their mourning into a day of celebration. So it is biblical in the sense that Mordecai, it's written in the Bible in Esther chapter 9, that he wrote to all the Jews saying, you're going to celebrate this day as a day that we overcame our enemies. And it's amazing that that tradition is carried down to this day.
What will you see on the streets in Israel?
Well, it's amazing because there's 2 days in Purim. The first day is Purim, and the second day is Purim, the Shushan Purim. And that's specifically a day that's celebrated in Jerusalem. So we're here in Jerusalem right now, and Jerusalem really is the holiday the place to be over Purim, because people are celebrating in the streets. People will dress up in costumes. They'll mask themselves, hide themselves, kind of in homage to Esther, who really became the queen and hid her Jewish identity from the king, from her husband, and from society as a whole for so long. And so people will dress up in different kind of costumes, similar maybe to how some people from the West would celebrate Halloween and dress up, but this time it's a celebration of life and of mourning turned to joy. And so everyone's dressed up, giving gifts to each other, having fun. And you'll also have a lot of drinking, because this is one of the only holidays in the Bible that the rabbis believe it is biblically commanded to get drunk. And that's interesting because there's nowhere in the Bible where it says that's what's supposed to happen, but I think that comes from turning mourning into joy. And so they just say, be happy. And so you see, as it gets later and later into the evening, it gets crazier and crazier on the streets into the early hours of the morning. And especially this year, because Purim fell on a Thursday night and went into Friday. Thursday nights are our weekend nights here. It's kind of like Friday night in the rest of the world. Everyone comes up to Jerusalem. The streets are packed and partying late into the night. And if you live in the city like I do, it's hard to go to sleep because there's sounds and music and noise all night long.
Is there a fast for Purim as well?
There is a fast of Esther, and that's earlier this month. Earlier in the month of Adar, there's a fast of Esther. That's not as widely celebrated by the community, the Jewish community around the world, but there are probably the more religious would celebrate that. And there actually, as part of the Messianic body here in Israel, there is a group in the Jerusalem area that does honor the fast of Esther as something that Esther fasted because God had put her in her position of authority, of influence for such a time as this.
Is this a joyous and happy celebration, happy holiday?
It's a very happy holiday. I would say it's probably one of the most happiest of holidays, and it's especially attended by young Israelis, young teenagers, young adults, kids. It's something that's very festive and celebratory, and it's very inclusive of the whole family. In the streets, it's also, you don't have the 60-year-olds coming out and partying. It's usually the young adults that are out in the streets late into the evenings.
What scriptures will be read in the synagogues?
So they always read the scroll of Esther, called the Megillah. And they'll read that in all the synagogues. They'll read that in the Messianic congregations in Israel. And as they're telling the story, because part of the biblical mandate is that they're retelling the story of what happened. As they're telling the story, they'll actually really get involved and have a kind of interactive experience. So every time that they say the name Haman obviously is the villain, the enemy in the story, everyone will say, boo! And they'll try to drown out the name of Haman. And they might stomp their feet and they might pound their fist. And the idea is to kind of blot out Haman's name the same way that Haman wanted the Jews to be blotted out from the earth. And every time that you say Mordecai's name, everyone cheer, and there's a lot of animation. And so when we tell this, even in our own congregation here in Israel, it's a way to get the kids involved. It's that retelling and passing it down, the truth from one generation to the next. And I think that's something the Jewish people do so well, that we're able to have this event that happened thousands and thousands of years ago, and yet still today in the modern state of Israel, around the world, it's still being celebrated.
And is there a special food that's eaten in Purim?
Other than obviously drinking a lot of alcohol, probably the most notable food is the dessert called, in English, called the Hamantaschen, which actually is Yiddish, and it means Haman's purse, but it kind of is shaped like Haman's hat, and there's tradition that Haman had this 3-point hat. Kind of looks like a pirate's hat, like if you watched Pirates of the Caribbean, kind of looks like Captain Jack Sparrow's hat. And so they have this dessert that has different kinds of fillings. Maybe it's dates, maybe it's chocolate, maybe it's berries, maybe it's poppy seeds is a little more of a traditional one. And in Hebrew, it's called Oznei Haman, or Haman's ears, the ears of Haman, because maybe they look like his ears as well. But in English, it would be called Haman's hat. And everyone's making that and eating that, different kinds, and you pick your favorite flavor, and that's one of the most notable foods from Purim.
Now, Esther is the story about anti-Semitism. What do you think is the root of anti-Semitism?
It's interesting because we see so much anti-Semitism in our day and age, and I think Purim is the evidence that this is not a new phenomenon. This is something that's been going on for thousands of years. It's not a Western phenomenon. It's something that's happening all over the world. And I really think the root of it is something that is satanic. It's something that transcends just a generation or just a culture. It's something that's Satan hates the Jewish people because God's chosen to put his name upon them and chosen them as a chosen people and a royal priesthood. And it's something that it's a spiritual thing, not just something in the flesh or something in the here and now. I think a lot of anti-Semites today might say, well, we're anti-Semitic because of the state of Israel and because they're an oppressor. But there's evidence of even when the Jews didn't have their own state, even when they were in exile, even when they were the underdog, yet still you have this man, Haman, that had this personal vendetta against the Jews. And so, like the book of Ephesians says, we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against spiritual powers and authorities in the heavenly realms. And I really think anti-Semitism comes from that.
Do you think there's a rise of anti-Semitism today around the world?
I think as there's more and more of an ignorance, especially in the Christian church, of God's heart for the Jewish people and their role in God's plan of redemption, their role in Bible, especially as we read our Old Testaments and think, well, that's what God used to be like, and now he's the God of grace and mercy in the New Testament, and maybe God's done away with the Jewish people. I think sometimes in our Christian faith, that's led some of the most famous theologians who we should revere and respect to assume and extrapolate that because the Jewish people in some part rejected Jesus as the Messiah, that we should also hate them and that God's judgment is on them. And that's not the narrative of Scripture. If you read through Romans 9 through 11, I think Paul's clear. Even in Israel's stumbling, it was not so that they would fall, and that there is a glorious redemption. It says in Romans 11, the gifts and calling of the Lord are irrevocable. And so if God has called and chosen Israel, despite maybe a momentary, temporary rejection, that it's leading to something else. And we cannot, as Christians, boast or be arrogant. As it says in Romans chapter 11, it says, don't let you, Gentiles from the nations that have been grafted into this heritage of the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, don't boast against those who've temporarily fallen off. Because if we do, God will cut you off. And it says that very strongly. And I think Paul knew he could look through the lens of time and see that maybe there would be this arrogance come towards the Jewish people. And he was saying, no, you can't be ignorant. I don't want you to be ignorant of this mystery, brothers. When the fullness of the Gentiles come in, then all of Israel will be saved. And God has not forgotten his people. He actually has a plan for the nations to be involved in his restoration of the Jewish people as well. So I think it is something that we need to consider, and it's something that as we need to be biblically literate, we need to be literate of the Old Testament and really understand what God's purpose is with a sober mind for the Jewish people and for Israel.
And what's your prayer for the Jews as they celebrate Purim this year?
Well, I think as we celebrate Purim, it's that this reminder would go out for a generation, that we would not just think of this holiday as a fun time to dress up and to get drunk. If that's all it is, it's really shallow. But really, if we actually see this as God raise up a generation of Mordecais and Esthers that would recognize that the positions of influence and authority they're put in is not in vain, it's not random, it's actually the working of a sovereign God who may have put you in this position for such a time as this. And as Christians, as people that have our own spheres of influence, we should also ask ourselves, are we willing to step up and be brave like Esther? Are we willing to step up and be brave like Mordecai? And even in recent history, thinking back to World War II, there's so many examples from things like with Corrie ten Boom and others that stood up for the Jewish people in the face of seeming annihilation, similar to Haman in a much darker sense. There were people that stood up and stood fast at that. And we have to ask ourselves, if that was to happen in our generation, would we do the same?
Okay, Michael, thank you very much.
Thank you, Paul.